When most people think of war, they usually think of the media's portrayal of it. Guns, bombs, tanks and planes, gritty trenches and sweltering jungles, moving storylines that revolve around admirable characters, their struggles, and their sacrifices. This juxtaposes the horrors of the battlefield with the honor and glory of being a soldier. However, the landscape of war is changing. The emergence of the internet in the late 20th century marked the beginning of the information age, making data an asset as valuable as oil was nearly a century ago. This has led to virtually every aspect of our daily lives leaving a digital footprint, whether it be putting on your favorite Spotify playlist on a morning run, looking up sources on Google for a class project, or streaming Netflix on a rainy day in. These send a constant stream of user data to companies, allowing them to improve their products by understanding your personal preferences and applying them to their algorithms, resulting in curated playlists to fit your music tastes or tailored advertisements for products that you've been meaning to buy. This results in large streams of ad revenue for companies, attracting even more users to their products, generating even more user data, and the cycle continues. The power of data is certainly something to not be underestimated. Now consider the fact that not only do private companies have unfettered access to this data goldmine, but that a country thousands of miles across the ocean, considered to be one of our biggest rivals, has the means to attain the same level of access.
The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China.
Long gone are the days when having the most well-trained and well-equipped military made a country top dog. The new principles of modern warfare no longer involve using armed force to compel the enemy, but rather any and all means, armed or unarmed. This has made the government's emphasis on allocating significant chunks of our national budget into our military-industrial complex seem excessive. Even more worrying is that the military-industrial complex has fallen victim to attacks by this new unarmed force. This new force is kind of like that shy, quiet new kid that transferred into your high school in the middle of the year. He's smart, diligent, and just a brand new face that's naturally attracting both positive and some negative attention as well. This kid's name? Cyber warfare. In recent times, national cybersecurity has been an increasingly emphasized issue in United States politics, especially in the context of relations with China, who has undoubtedly grown to be one of the world's great superpowers. China's rapid economic development can be best visualized by the city of Shenzhen, which grew from a small fishing town of around 30,000 residents to a bustling megacity of over 12 million people. It became a manufacturing and technology hub, grounding a name for itself as China's Silicon Valley. Huawei, the Chinese smartphone company which has been the target of sanctions by the Trump administration since 2018 for its potential ties to the Communist Party of China, has its headquarters based in Shenzhen. Huawei is on a list of many other Chinese tech giants that have been added to the United States blacklist, the most recent of which being Tencent and ByteDance, who operate the apps WeChat and TikTok respectively. These hardline sanctions against Chinese tech companies are not limited to the US government. India announced its ban on 59 Chinese-developed apps in June, citing concerns over national security. That ban came weeks after 20 Indian troops were killed in clashes with the Chinese military along a disputed border. In July, the United Kingdom announced its ban on the purchase of Huawei equipment from being used in its planned nationwide 5G wireless network. This came after Beijing passed its Hong Kong national security law in the former British colony, effectively restricting free speech and criminalizing criticism of the Chinese government. The actions of all three of these powerful governments serve as an effort to recognize and check China's growing global influence, most notably in the technology sector. Ironically, the rest of the world is currently doing to China what the country itself has been methodically doing with foreign websites, apps, and social media platforms for decades, via its heavily censored Great Firewall. So one might view these recent actions as simply getting even with China. However, if these back and forth jabs between China and the rest of the world fail to de-escalate, the consequences could be sinister. This begs the question, will the United States' aggressiveness towards Chinese tech firms contribute to a possible outbreak of cyber warfare between the two countries? Before we begin, let's dive into a little context about China's history. Imperial China had enjoyed a period of economic prosperity and cultural dominance in East Asia, with its culture and customs heavily influencing those of neighboring Korea and Japan, remnants of which can still be seen today. However, quote, the 19th and early 20th centuries saw the dismantling of the Sino-centric order that had dominated much of East Asia by the industrial European empires. China has significantly fallen behind the West technologically, leading to a series of continual losses and conflicts to foreign powers, resulting in losses in territory and a tarnishing of its image on the world stage. This era from between 1839 and 1949 was dubbed the Century of Humiliation, and the term was conceived at a time of growing Chinese nationalism and distrust of foreign influence. This shameful period in China's history fueled the platforms of nationalist revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen and Mao Zedong to restore China's greatness, and the Century of Humiliation had finally ended in 1949, with Mao Zedong's Communist Party of China's victory in the Chinese Civil War. In Mao's speech announcing the establishment of the People's Republic of China, he declared that China had finally stood up, a fact that Mao's successors had sought to further demonstrate to the rest of the world. However, China understood that trying to build itself back up through its military would prove to be a really risky move, given its 100-year losing streak and all. So China needed to find an alternative way to build itself back up. And so things began to change under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, who sought to bring an end to the decades of suffering under Mao's disastrous Great Leap Forward that resulted in a famine killing 18 to 45 million people, along with the Cultural Revolution, which persecuted intellectuals and enemies of the state, killing another 20 million people. Deng went in to abolish the old, isolationist, self-sufficient policies of Mao's reign and begin a new era of reform and opening, along with establishing diplomatic relations with the international community, the first of which was with the United States under President Nixon. Deng realized that China's economic development would require a stable, external environment that was conducive to international trade and investment. And he saw that the best pathway to prosperity was to gradually integrate China into the US international order. As a result, China has risen to become a world power through a rate of economic and social development never before been seen in such a short amount of time. China has increased its per capita income 25-fold, and more than 800 million Chinese people lifted themselves out of poverty as a result, more than 70% of the total poverty reduction in the world. This is especially evident with the rise of China's upper and middle class, who have benefited greatly from the rise of the internet and smartphone technologies. If you take a look around China, using your phone to scan QR codes to pay for goods and services has become commonplace, both in the city and the countryside. At the same time, these developments have bred a new generation of tech entrepreneurs, like Jack Ma of Alibaba, think China's Amazon, and Zhang Yiming, founder and CEO of ByteDance, most famously or infamously known for the popular TikTok app. While China has fully embraced technology to bolster its economy and make a name for itself on the world stage, it has also learned to make use of it in some pretty nefarious ways. The United States began to pioneer the use of the internet and other cyber tactics during the Iraq War, placing them at the forefront of this new frontier of warfare at the time. The book, At War, by Shane Harris, senior national security writer at the Washington Post, begins with the story of Bob Stasio, a member of the US Army Signals Intelligence Corps who was deployed to Iraq in 2007 as a part of the 4th Brigade and 2nd Infantry Division, also known as the Raiders. The Raiders had made use of a counterintelligence system called the Prophet, which was outdated in that it only picked up on radio waves and not phone calls, text messages, or emails, the new medium of communication that Iraqi insurgents were using. So before deployment, Stasio and a fellow lieutenant had devised a concept called reachback. On the field, Intelligence units would have their own computers and networks that could wiretap phone calls and intercept emails, but these would also reach back to intelligence agencies back in the US that used these units as proxies to collect vast amounts of information. This system proved itself to be extremely effective. To quote the book, "The tide of the war in Iraq finally turned in the United States' favor, and that alliance between the spy agency and the military, forged in Iraq, would forever change the way America fights wars." However, years passed, and the US saw its newfound strength being turned around against itself, being backdoored by Chinese hackers who from between 2009 and 2013 gained remote access from China to information residing on the computer systems of US companies, including cleared defense contractors such as Lockheed Martin and Boeing. At War's prologue explains why it was defense contractors and not the military that were targeted by the hackers. Their computer systems were generally less defended than the military's top-secret networks, the most sensitive of which weren't even connected to the internet. The hackers simply found another way in, targeting the firms to which the military outsourced so many of its key operations. News of these breaches sparked a national conversation about cybersecurity and its importance in the 21st century. In October of 2012, former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta warned that the United States was on the verge of a cyber Pearl Harbor, an attack that would cause physical destruction and the loss of life, that would paralyze and shock the nation, and create a profound new sense of vulnerability, in response to the very real possibility of a cyber attack on America's infrastructure systems and financial databases. In May of that same year, former President Barack Obama had written in a newspaper editorial that the internet was the fighting grounds of the future, where an adversary unable to match our military supremacy on the battlefield might seek to exploit our computer vulnerabilities here at home. This strategy of avoiding conventional warfare, an area that hasn't historically been your strong suit, sounds a little familiar, right? To quote the legendary Chinese general Sun Tzu, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." Fast forwarding to today, and cyber warfare skirmishes have gotten a lot more covert. Rather than direct attacks on private and federal military databases, China has penetrated its way into the data harvesting of consumers. This was seen in Huawei's attempt to break into the US market with its line of consumer smartphones and its ambitions to be a part of the US 5G network. However, these moves raise some major national security concerns. Although Huawei claims to be a privately owned company, it has a very complicated ownership structure. Coupled with the fact that the Chinese government is a major stakeholder in virtually all Chinese corporations, this raised some legitimate grounds of concern for the US government.
An awful lot of large Chinese businesses are state-owned enterprises, literally owned by the government and thus the party. But even if they aren't, China's laws allow its government to compel any Chinese company to provide any information it requests, including American citizens' data.
This is a pretty chilling prospect, as the data stored on Huawei phones sold to American consumers could be handed over to the Chinese government at their beck and call. In addition, the equipment that Huawei wants to use in the US's 5G network could potentially have backdoors that the Chinese government could exploit to remotely access cell towers and launch cyber attacks by disrupting network signals. If one were to gain full access to a country's 5G network, then theoretically, all data transfers between devices can be viewed and intercepted, including confidential military plans, academic papers, engineering files, surveillance camera feeds, basically anything being sent over 5G. More recently, there was buzz going around a Reddit post made by a user who was a software engineer by occupation. The user reverse engineered the insanely popular app TikTok and made some pretty concerning findings. Although it's known that most social media apps collect user data to an extent, TikTok was shown to be very excessive in its data collection methods. One of the most publicized flaws of the app came with the iOS 14 update, in which iPhone users were being notified that TikTok was fetching copied clipboard items. The app was also shown to have constant GPS pinging enabled, which would happen whenever a user would geotag a post. However, The most alarming functionality of the app was the fact that it could recognize if a user is probing into its source code, and would change its behavior slightly to confuse and deter individuals from further messing with the application. TikTok is, quote, a data collection service that is thinly veiled as a social network. Unsurprisingly, federal employees have been banned from installing the application on their devices, citing fears of espionage. This fear has also seeped into the private sector as well, with Wells Fargo being one of the first corporations to take the government's lead. There is, without a doubt, an atmosphere of skepticism towards Chinese tech that is fully backed by the government. And while it is in the best interest for national security and protecting the data privacy of US citizens, failing to de-escalate these tensions would prove symptomatic for the future. There is a strong likelihood that a second Trump administration would have a high risk of further straining relations between the US and China. Both governments see themselves in the right when it comes to dealing with each other's technologies. So the US government's existing ban on Huawei technologies, as well as its potential ban on TikTok, isn't really that odd when you look at what China has been doing with American tech firms for the past few years, banning Google services, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, you name it. So the passing of these protectionist economic policies, coupled with a growing sentiment that promotes a rhetoric of scrutiny against the Chinese government, have contributed to the current political climate towards China. This current climate can be best summarized by 3 key points. A. It is politically popular to attack companies for potential ties to China. This has recently been seen in President Trump's re-election campaign, which pushed Facebook ads bashing TikTok for its potential ties to Beijing. Furthermore, B. TikTok and other Chinese applications pose a real potential threat to US interests simply because of its ties to China. And C. There is a troubling and growing tendency to associate anything remotely Chinese as untrustworthy. So we've established that these attitudes would only further strain US-China relations moving forward into the future. But what solution can be offered with regards to Chinese technology that can help to alleviate these tensions and welcome Chinese competitors into the US market? This sets the stage for a long-term, neutral solution moving forward, which would adhere all tech companies, both foreign and domestic, to a universal set of standards regarding data storage and use, requiring the disclosure of algorithms, and having open-door policies for auditing and enforcement. This would force US tech firms to respect user privacy, as well as allow for foreign tech firms to continue doing business in the United States, promoting a sense of competition and the need for constant innovation by domestic companies, all while not directing scrutiny to a specific people group. Because in the end, this is a long-term solution to a long-term problem, as there will always be another TikTok and another Huawei. So rather than continuing to stigmatize Chinese companies, we should try to make an effort to learn to coexist with our Chinese neighbors, as it would mutually benefit both countries' economies and societies, as well as prevent the escalation of tensions into a full-blown war.
Confronting this threat effectively does not mean we shouldn't do business with the Chinese. It does not mean we shouldn't host Chinese visitors. It does not mean we shouldn't welcome Chinese students or coexist with China on the world stage. But it does mean that when China violates our criminal laws and international norms, we are not going to tolerate it, much less enable it. The FBI and our partners throughout the US government will hold China accountable and protect our nation's innovation, ideas, and way of life with the help and vigilance of the American people. Thank you for having me here.